Hi, good afternoon. Welcome to Spy Chat. I'm Amanda Olkey, Director of Adult Education at the International Spy Museum here in Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining us today. We have two terrific speakers, as always. We have my Executive Director, Chris Costa, and today he's joined by Frank Figliuzzi. Frank is the former Assistant Director for Counterintelligence at the FBI. He served 25 years as a special agent and directed all espionage investigations across the government. He held leadership positions in major American cities from Atlanta to San Francisco and was the Assistant Special Agent in charge of the Miami field office, one of the FBI's largest. In 2006, he became the special agent in charge of the Cleveland division, which incorporates the major cities of Northern Ohio. Prior to that, in 2005, he was appointed the FBI's chief inspector by then Director Robert Mueller. Frank is the author of The FBI Way Inside the Bureau's Code of Excellence, and that is an excellent book. And Frank, you may know well as a national security contributor and regular columnist for NBC News and MSNBC. And he also hosts the podcast, The Bureau with Frank Figliuzzi. Now, before I turn this over to Chris, I want to share very special thanks to our sponsors. First, the Honorable Mary Beth Long, who serves on the International Spy Museum Board of Directors and is an extraordinary supporter of the museum. And she is joined in sponsorship today by MAG Aerospace. And we really want to thank Spy Museum Governing Board member Joe Fluet, who is the CEO and founder of MAG Aerospace. We want to thank him for championing support of the Spy Museum. And we really are thrilled to enjoy the generosity of sponsors such as both of you. So that is enough from me. You're here to hear from Chris and Frank. So over to you, Chris.
Amanda, as always, thanks for the great introduction and also the shout out to our sponsors. We are very grateful to Mary Beth Long and of course, Joe and MAG Aerospace. So last month, take you back for those of you who joined us, we had General Petraeus and we focused a lot on counterterrorism in that it was 20 years since 9/11. We had a discussion about Afghanistan and a range of other terrorism related issues. Today, I'm really pleased to have Frank. I've been following him for some time and I'll plug his book a little more toward the end of my brief remarks. But I think counterintelligence is a very important subject, and China continues to come up, not only in the media, but also academicians and lots of pundits talking about where things are going with China. But it's very much related to a counterintelligence fight, if you will. So we're going to talk about counterintelligence, but of course, the audience can take us anywhere they want to go. So I'm going to kick off with the first counterintelligence or China story that I've been tracking, and it relates to Taiwan and a small presence of U.S. special operators who have been on the ground in Taiwan. It's been very low visibility. They've been working with Taiwanese partners, and that certainly upsets China. Given that there's a one China policy and strategic ambiguity. But what's important is the fact that the United States has used a small footprint of special operators to work with Taiwan and bolster their confidence, because China of late has been extremely threatening to Taiwan. That really helps me transition to the next article that I've been tracking very closely. You may have seen the reporting in the media, in the Washington Post in particular, that CIA has stood up a new mission center. We shouldn't be surprised that the mission center has been stood up to focus on China. I think this is a good trajectory. It's important. It focuses CIA espionage operations worldwide on China can be focused out of that center, as well as counterintelligence related operations. It helps to fuse operations that are happening worldwide. And it really puts an additional emphasis on countering China malign behavior, and at the very least, understanding China capabilities and intentions, which of course is part and parcel what the community should be doing. In this case, the US intelligence community. The next article that really got my attention, I'm going to read the headline, and Frank's going to help me out. And if there are additional questions on this, the headline is this, and it's a question, and it comes from Washington Post. The China initiative aims to stop economic espionage. Is targeting academics over grant fraud overkill? So what is this all about? It means that the United States has been aggressive from a counterintelligence standpoint for some time on China. It started under the AG Sessions, the Attorney General Sessions in the Trump administration, the idea that the United States was going to pull the threads and conduct investigations to ensure that China wasn't soliciting for researchers to do essentially intelligence collection for China. And we know that China researchers, it's one government very much focused on national security. There isn't a division of labor. If you work in China, you're going to support national security objectives. It's very different in China than it is perhaps in the rest of the world. All of that said, there's been some questioning of this strategy, suggesting that FBI has been extremely aggressive on academicians and researchers that are ethnic American Chinese, and there's been some questioning that perhaps the FBI has been overly aggressive. I don't know an answer to that question, and I don't know how to parse the details because, frankly, China has been aggressively going after our researchers here in the United States, and the researchers have been concealing their ties to China. That, at the end of the day, turns out to be fraud, not espionage. So it's a question of where does this fall in national security priorities? So that's the question. Some have suggested that US objectives here have strayed and have gone too far in one direction or the other. So I'll be interested to hear from Frank. It's a complicated subject, but I think it's important in light of our discussion about China today. More broadly, transitioning a little bit, it was reported in the New York Times that the CIA sent out a classified cable to worldwide stations and reminding the CIA of their security requirements for protecting sources, which in the field, they hardly need to be reminded of that, arguably, because it's in the ethos of CIA and any intelligence officer to protect your sources. All of that said, there have been a series, perhaps a dozen plus compromises in the last few years. So this was a general warning. Some of those compromises, some of those disrupted operations came from Iran, came from Russia, came from China. Some of these individuals have been executed for committing espionage. So that's a problem, and it relates to really two streams of consciousness. One suggests that the CIA has spent too much time focusing on counterterrorism, and they've lost some of their high-end tradecraft skills. I take a different view, and it's the view that there's ubiquitous surveillance. That's a term of art now. Countries across the world have capabilities, social media, cell phone collection, all kinds of technical capabilities to include facial recognition that really make the operational environment that much harder to operate. So I think a warning to the field is normal and prudent business. The operational environment will continue to become extremely challenging of the counterintelligence capabilities of our adversaries worldwide. That changing the gears a little bit, we talked a little bit about China. Let's talk about Russia. So let's go full circle and think about Cold War intelligence directed against Russia and our counterintelligence capabilities. Think about a major objective of the Russian intelligence services has been NATO. So while we're very much focused on China itself, of late, Russia again has had a series or several Russian intelligence officers, 8, that'll be sent out of Brussels because their target was NATO. They were undeclared. They were intelligence officers masquerading as diplomats. They're sent persona non grata back to Russia. I expect there'll be a tit for tat, but in the media cycle of late, there hasn't been a lot of discussion about that news that broke out, because we've been very much focused on China and other issues. Again, relatedly, another case that Andrew Hammond, our historian, talked to the media about, I think is fascinating. Frank might have some insights on this. It's U.S. has charged a Navy engineer and a Navy engineer's wife, a civilian, a former Navy officer from Annapolis, Maryland. They were arrested, I believe, in West Virginia, executing part of the trade craft, part of the plan. They presumed very carefully that the indictment that can be found online is very detailed to include some of the trade craft involved with this case. But the short version is, it seems that these two American citizens reached out to a foreign country, a name that the name of that country has not been released. I'm not going to speculate about it, but apparently it's a friendly country to the United States. So it's not Russia, it's not China, it's not what we would consider an adversary necessarily. We'll see. But they reached out to that respective country, and reportedly the country went right to the FBI. The FBI assiduously plugged in an FBI undercover, and an operation that's gone for about a year came to its end when the couple was arrested in West Virginia. I think it's a fascinating story. They are tried to, or they were trying to pass, interestingly enough, nuclear submarine technology, restricted information. So it's a fascinating case. You should pay attention to it as we go forward. And to break away from classic counterintelligence, I want to talk about a political violence story, arguably. And it has to do with the FBI having an informant among the Proud Boys. This was reported in the Washington, I'm sorry, it was reported in the New York Times. I wanted to be sure I got the sourcing right. That an informant from Proud Boys was reporting to his FBI handler leading up to the breach of the Capitol. He was reporting that he had no idea that the Proud Boys had any intention to breach the Capitol that day. He didn't know of any conspiracy. And there's been a lot of questions back and forth. Well, does that throw the government's case that there was a conspiracy by the Proud Boys to breach the Capitol? Why didn't an informant know? And if we step back, my simple analysis of this is as follows. The bottom line is, each informant's going to have a different placement and access. They're going to have a different access to information. The fact that there was an informant talking to the FBI is very positive from my standpoint. The FBI has an obligation, and Frank knows this better than most, to protect the Constitution and to ensure that there aren't felonious conspiracies being waged. So I don't know how many informants the FBI had, but I'm heartened to know there were informants, and I'm not surprised at all that this particular informant maybe didn't have the details that his handler was looking for. Not surprising at all. The final two stories are related to hostages. China has finally freed the two Canadians known as the two Michaels, one diplomat and one former Canadian diplomat, and a former Canadian businessman, both rolled up by China, spent over 1,000 days in captivity, unadulterated hostage diplomacy. And this really underscores China's malign and adversarial behavior. They were arrested for espionage offenses and were ready to spend a long time in captivity in China. This was hostage diplomacy because this seems to have been retaliation for the Canadians arresting a Chinese executive from Huawei, a Chinese company. The Huawei executive was going to be extradited into the United States, and China was very upset with that. Hence, a long negotiation presumably played out, and in the end, the Huawei executive admitted to some wrongdoing, fraud, and she went back to China. The two Michaels were released. That is a good news story, but it underscores the kinds of behaviors that states are doing with regard to hostages, and it's inimical to good, frankly, good diplomacy, right? And that really transitions into another story on hostages, very different from a standpoint that it was a group of missionaries that were taken hostage, 16 American missionaries, some children, and one Canadian are being held hostage by a criminal gang on the ground in Haiti. Now, I know that the FBI is working this case very diligently, and the United States is not only working it diplomatically, but also from an investigative standpoint, and probably looking at a range of other options. Of course, 17 hostages is significant. We can talk more about that case in question and answers. So these are all of the things that I've been tracking since last Spy Chat. So I hope we have some great questions. I know we will. And the last point I want to make, we already mentioned Frank's book, The FBI Way. I read the book and I very much appreciate the tenor, the tone, the value from the standpoint of leadership and the ethos of the FBI. It's a commitment to excellence, and like any organization, you have your ups and downs. And Frank, story. So I really encourage our audience to pick up a copy of Frank's book. So I will stop there.
Hi, Chris.
Hey,
Thanks
Frank.
for having me.
Have you?
And thank you really for this really quick and concise update of intelligence related matters in the news. I think you're providing a service simply by doing that. If I could respond to, I think, three different items you brought up in the news real quickly, just for my thoughts on them. First, on the Russia, let's talk first about what I call the peanut butter sandwich spies, the married couple that gave up nuclear secrets, including secrets to the propulsion for the Virginia class fast attack nuclear propelled submarine. All right, this is about as serious as it gets. The good news, as you say, is that when they approached a foreign country to offer this up, the foreign country eventually turned this over to the FBI, and there was a successful operation that ended in the couple's arrest. As I like to say, though, Chris, whenever there's an arrest, whenever you're putting handcuffs on people for selling secrets, it reflects both a success and a failure. So let's talk about that. I wrote a column. I have a column that appears regularly at MSNBC Daily. That's their online platform. And my last column is on this very topic, the peanut butter sandwich spies. We're saying that because in their dead drops, they secreted their data cards in a half a peanut butter sandwich, in a package of chewing gum, and in another package. I think it may have been cigarettes or something else that escapes me right now. But here's the deal. Why is this a failure? It's a failure because it happened in the first place. If you read through the charging document, it's a pretty scary story of how long this couple has been accumulating, gathering, secreting out of the husband's workspace, planning to someday commit espionage or violate the Atomic Secrets Act, because he talks about, in his communications with an undercover agent who he thinks is this foreign country, he says, I've been collecting this for years, taking it out of my office. He talks about using an encrypted platform for communications that he acquired a long time ago on vacation, that it seems for this purpose. So we've got a security failure here. Now, the interesting part of this, the good side of this story is, yeah, it does appear that this was some ally of ours, or at least if they aren't a traditional ally, they certainly have positioned themselves now to be that. But there's a question here. By my count, there's about an 8-month gap, if you're to read the charging document as entirely accurate, and it may not be. There's often an untold story when you're looking at a charging document. But from the time the foreign country received a U.S. postal package with an initial offer and a tranche of data in it from the couple, to the time that that country turned it over to an FBI legal attaché in presumably that country, there's about 8 months. So I don't know if COVID played a role in that delay. I don't know what a foreign nation did with a tranche of documents on nuclear secrets for 8 months. There's a story there that needs to be told. Why are we saying that this is an ally? Because I think that's an important question, because in my career, I have seen adversaries report what they believe is a provocation or something that's too good to be true. So they get spooked and they report it. And an infamous example of that is that Robert Hanssen, the greatest spy in FBI history, was during his spy career for the Russians, was reported by the Russians. Now, they didn't know that he was for real. They didn't know that it was Robert Hanssen at the FBI, but they did report when he switched. There was a period during his 10 years of spying for the Russians where he went dormant, and then he came back and tried to offer his services to the other Russian intelligence agency, and they didn't know what was going on, and they reported it out of concern that this was a trap. So even adversaries will turn over what they believe is a provocation. But why we're saying that this is an ally, the cool part of the story is that the married couple, out of a sense of security, said to the undercover FBI agent, listen, for us to really believe that you are this foreign country, we'd like you to post a signal to us proving that it's really you, and we'd like you to do it at your building, which I take to mean their diplomatic establishment in the United States, likely perhaps their embassy in Washington, D.C. Well, lo and behold, the FBI approached that country and said, would you mind, as part of this operation, if we posted a signal to these people? And the country said yes, and let the FBI do it. That's pretty cool, and I think unprecedented, at least in my experience. So something that bears watching. You also, let's see, you brought up two other issues. Oh, let's talk about China in the sense of the China initiative, and more importantly, I think equally important, this question of, have we been too aggressive in bringing prosecution against Chinese nationals, particularly academics and researchers? The quick answer is the very fact that you and I are talking about this is evidence that this has become a problem. Because at the point where your counterintel operations begin to become the subject of public debate, where people are talking about failed prosecutions, declined prosecutions, dropped prosecutions, you're failing. Why is that happening? The very inherent nature of the China threat, the intelligence threat, the spy threat, is so multifaceted and holistic that it has challenged the counterintelligence community for decades. And you see this aggressiveness coming because it's very difficult, for example, to say that person is a spy. They're working as a government sponsor for a government-sponsored spy. We can tell you they are working with MSS or PLA in China, and here's the evidence. It is extremely difficult to do that because of the nature of the threat. And as you mentioned, the incredible machine that is Chinese intelligence collection, where it is literally against state law in China to decline a request from the intelligence services for a citizen to cooperate and collect. It's against the law. And life can become extremely miserable for your family and friends back in China if you're not playing ball upon request. So in that environment, literally everyone becomes a collector. And if you can't attribute strongly and say, here's the handler, here's the person in the consulate who's handling this Chinese person on US soil, if you can't do that reliably, you start seeing this kind of creative prosecution. Well, they lied on this form. They lied on a grant. They're part of the China 1,000 Talents program, and they never disclosed to their employer that they were in talks with the China 1,000 Talents program. Well, from the outside looking in, that looks really weak, and it is. but sometimes it's all you have. And at its worst, done at its worst, it turns into profiling ethnic Chinese and Chinese nationals, which we can't have. So we've got to get better at this. I've also seen in my career, Chris, examples where unbeknownst to even the FBI, there is a case that looks like it's perfect, wrapped up in a bow, ready for prosecution or even charged. And another three-letter agency will come in and go, hey, we just got wind of this prosecution, and there's going to be a problem because in the criminal discovery process, you're going to have to turn over what we have over here at our agency, which can never see the light of day. That's happened a couple of times in my career. And sometimes those cases you see dismissed are because even the FBI was not aware at the time that highly classified singular sources and methods are possessed by the US government regarding this person. And that becomes problematic. So we got to get better at this. The failed prosecutions are undermining the counterintelligence effort, and that's a mistake, and that's a problem. And Chris, there was a Russian, I think there was a Russian matter that you may have mentioned at the start of your brief, if I'm right.
Sorry, took me a second to unmute. It was the 8 intelligence officers that are sent persona non grata out of Brussels with tensions high, but the Russians have been spying on NATO across the board. This has really aggravated the Russians, of course, so we'll see more tit for tat.
Yeah, I think your viewers, your listeners are savvy enough to know that this is how it works. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction, and we're going to see that play out here. So this is kind of par for the course.
All right, I think, Frank, we are, first of all, that is exactly why we wanted to have you here. I really appreciated the detail and the background, very helpful for our audience. I know I learned a lot. Your insights are key. So I think we're ready for questions and answers. So this is when I get a chance to say, Amanda, take over.
Hi, okay. And I know more will start flooding in now, but real simple question right off the bat. Do you think the US should stop economic partnerships with China?
You want me to field that one first, Chris?
Go ahead, Frank. You get all the tough questions first.
Gee, thank you. So, I have the perspective of not only 25 years at FBI and the privilege of heading the counterintelligence program, but also serving as a corporate security executive for a major global corporation post my FBI career, and then as a security consultant with major corporations. So I have seen, my thinking has evolved on this. The bottom line is that I think the more that we are engaged globally, financially and economically, the more our economies are intertwined, the less likely we are to get into a shooting war and hostilities. I say my position has evolved because I think if you got me early in my FBI career, I would have said nothing but negative things about economic relationships. I would have said companies should shy away from business in China. Manufacturing joint ventures are all fraught with peril. They are fraught with peril, and my career, both in the government and the private sector, has proven that. But, I see this as a reality of today's global economy, and I see value in smartly, carefully, selectively proceeding with partnerships and economic ventures with China, because I believe it actually has the chance of reducing tensions, not escalating them.
So I'm going to jump in there and say I agree 100% with Frank. Furthermore, I had the opportunity to sit at the White House and watch General McMaster talk a lot about China. Matt Pottinger at the time was responsible at the NSC for China policy, and he's brilliant. He's lived in China, and he knows China very well. So I had an opportunity to listen to their perspectives. I also recently dusted off an article that McMaster wrote, and he talked about China's tendency to execute a policy of coercion, co-option, and concealment. And that underlies what we've talked about here. But at the same time, you have to have a deep, deep understanding of China from a historical standpoint, which we don't necessarily have here in the West. I certainly don't have that. But what I do know, and what we've been talking about for some time, is this idea that, first of all, democracies don't normally fight democracies. China is not a democracy, but we are so inextricably linked with our economic ties that might prevent conflict. Because imagine, look, because of COVID right now, look at what's happening to the supply chain. Imagine a conflict with China. It's almost unimaginable. No one really wants that. That said, I believe that this is going to require intensive diplomacy. It's going to require deterrence. It's going to require international cooperation and perhaps new treaties. It's going to require rolling in Japan. There are a lot of issues that are cross-cutting. I just think it's fascinating. It's something we should pay attention to. And there are a lot of second and third order effects. But I don't think China wants a war. And I don't think the United States wants a war. That said, I do worry about the 1914, I said it right, 1914, leading up to World War I, the guns of August, the idea that we can have conflict based on unintended consequences. Mistakes made operationally, ships and vessels getting too close to one another, misreading signals. So I worry about that. And I also worry about language trying to equate this to a Cold War, because it's not a Cold War, it's strategic competition. And people can debate me on that, but my humble view is this is strategic competition with a near peer competitor. I think, though, that Frank is 100% right, and I hope he's right. I don't want to see a conflict with China.
Sort of carrying along with that theme, why is Huawei still permitted to have offices in the U.S.? Any thoughts on that?
This one is delicate, and often I have to parse out what I know from my counterintelligence days versus what's public information. But this links back to generally what Chris and I were saying about the intense pressure and the counterintelligence challenges posed by China, because they come at this very asymmetrically. Their corporate entities are under as much pressure, or quite frankly, more pressure than their citizens are, to cooperate. They don't come here. They don't exist without the permission of the Chinese Communist Party and leadership. And there's tremendous challenges there. Even if they were to decline because of risk to their business future to participate in intel collection, they could quickly cease to exist. So there's a threat there. In my days back in the counterintelligence division, I give all credit to the Australian services for helping us as they led the way in identifying the threat posed by Huawei as a government-sponsored threat. And I will tell you personally, we should look at Huawei as a state-sponsored entity and a state-sponsored threat.
I don't have anything further to add. That's a great articulation of the problem, the challenges, and the dilemmas of the United States in particular dealing with Huawei. Although I will say parenthetically, I was in the room with an unnamed prime minister, and he underscored his commitment to really to not cooperate with Huawei. So many countries in the world are on that bandwagon and understand the threat of Huawei, and frankly have turned their back against that corporate interest, if you will.
I'll just say, Amanda, there's a larger, this raises the whole, and we could do this for an hour, but this raises the larger issue of supply chain security. Where is your telecom coming from? Where are you buying your routers from? Who owns your infrastructure? This isn't just a China problem. This is a supply chain infrastructure problem that is really haunting us right now, and it will well into the future.
So I promise you, not all the questions are about China, but I like to lump things together, as Chris knows. So I'll ask a couple more, and then we'll switch gears, I promise. But this is an intriguing question from the UK, wondering about Chinese mercenaries. Do you think that China is going to just deploy mercenaries in areas where strategic mining operations take place?
Chris, you want to take a crack at that one?
I'll take a crack at it. So I haven't seen any specific cases of China employing mercenaries, but I'll step back and reflect for just a second or two. And I've seen mercenaries on the ground, at least through reporting and publicly, of course. I've seen the Wagner Group in places, now we're talking about Russia, in places like Libya. I've seen the Wagner Group in places like Syria. It is and of course, we've heard about similar organizations being employed in the Crimea. So the bottom line is our competitors are going to employ organizations that, for lack of a better term, look and behave like mercenaries, right? This is the kind of conflict we're in. It's called gray zone. It's short of war. So I am very concerned about surrogates that are really employed by the government, but might look like security contractors. We've seen this with Russia. So there's no expectation on my part that China won't behave in similar ways. But again, these countries are trying to find the threshold to avoid US conflict directly. So this is an indirect form of warfare. There are different names for it. China has called it unrestricted warfare, fighting without, or warfare without fighting. People are fond of quoting of Sun Tzu when they talk about China, but at the end of the day, it is a tried and proven strategy to employ these proxy forces. And we haven't even talked about Iran and IRGC Quds forces. So we are going to be challenged in places like we've never, when I say we, in this case, the context is the United States. But I think also our foreign partners are dealing with this as well, because they're in the same spaces that these actors operate in. So that's how I would address the question. But now I'm sorry, go ahead, Frank.
No, I want to echo what you're saying, because look, from my counterintelligence perspective, this idea of mercenaries is not at all unlike what we see China doing in intelligence collection, right? The use of students, researchers, penetrations in corporations, all of this gives them plausible deniability, increases, it's a force multiplier for them. The ability to say that's not us, as they've done, when way back years back when we charged 5 PLA hackers, right? China said, hey, maybe we should be using civilians more to do our hacking, and there's more plausible deniability. So I see this happening. I'd be surprised if it doesn't happen. I think it's a good question.
Okay, I promised there's more China in the Q&A box, but I'm going to switch gears. And I'm going to go over to one of Chris's favorite topics. That sounds weird, but hostages is a theme that he is interested in. And I thought this was a cool question. Wondering about the Citgo 6 oil executives in Venezuela. Do you feel that they are being held hostage by Venezuela and Russia?
So I'll be interested to hear Frank's perspectives. I haven't followed the case closely, and I will in the future. I do think this is a classic case, though, of hostage diplomacy, similar to China. These Citgo 6 have been a political football. So this is the idea of a unlawful detention. And the United States has a responsibility to its citizens to work these cases from the State Department. In my White House time, I would have been more focused on hostages that were held by terrorists or states that do not acknowledge holding terrorists, holding hostages, like Syria in the situation, the case of Austin Tice, who's still being held by Syria. So I did not track closely the Citgo 6, but I will underscore that it seems to me that this is a case of hostage diplomacy, and it's wrong, and the United States will continue to put diplomatic pressure on Venezuela. In Venezuela doing Russia's bidding, I think it's very plausible that they are. So this is very much a throwback to Cold War-like behavior in Central America and in some cases South America. So it's a case I will look at more closely in the future. Excellent question, though.
Yeah, so similarly for me, this is not a case squarely in the center of my radar screen, but I can say this: it's not getting enough attention. The concern that Russia and Venezuela might be in concert on something like this is deeply troubling. I'm hopeful that our intelligence community is working on this, trying to get insights into what's going on. But moving forward into the future, I would expect Russia to increase its partnership with countries like Venezuela and cause and stir trouble from that approach.
Now I want to depart to one of my favorite parts of the program when we get these questions, which feel very targeted at young people who are thinking about careers in national security. And the IC and a very savvy person asks about the worries about facial recognition software on TikTok and the long-term implications for people who are doing their dances, doing their cool short-term videos, but eventually they want to grow up and work in the IC. Do you see any impact? Is that something to be concerned about?
I'll take that, and then I'm really eager to hear Chris's thoughts on this because of his background specifically. But I know that as I was departing the Counterintelligence Division for retirement, the topic of what the future looked like for undercover agents, for the agency's personnel who work under the deepest cover, what that all would look like. And I can tell you that the community was deeply concerned that the ability to withstand scrutiny, particularly from a state sponsor, particularly from a sophisticated foreign intelligence service, was becoming really problematic. And this notion that as young people enter the intelligence community, their own personal social media will come back to haunt them is a valid concern. It's a challenge. The good news is it's being worked on in the intelligence community. This issue of establishing bona fides and legends for people in an undercover capacity is happening, but it is a huge challenge. The bright spot there perhaps is that this is a challenge for all services around the globe, including our adversaries. Social media, I think in the United States, we tend to think, social media is all about America, and it's not. So the same issues prevail there, probably to a lesser extent with some of our adversaries. But a deep challenge, a great question, and it's going to cause the community to have to rise to the occasion and figure this out.
Yeah, Frank's exactly right. I don't have that much to offer other than to say this goes full circle to our questions about ubiquitous surveillance and future trade craft and the challenges. I am really glad that my trade craft was old school and I didn't have these kinds of concerns of facial recognition and social media. I would say that what we can do collectively is educate young adults so that they're more circumspect, that they don't make mistakes today. And of course, youth always make mistakes, every generation, but if they're more aware of their social media presence and that someday they're going to grow up and they might want to do security work, they can be more circumspect. Of course, yeah, it is a problem, TikTok, with facial recognition software, and the military is, as far as I know, I've only heard unofficially, obviously, but I've heard that service members aren't allowed to use TikTok. I don't know if that's accurate or not, but I think everyone would be wise to be very, very aware of this changing dynamic. I do not envy case officers today. It was a lot easier in the past when it was old school, bricks and sticks, if you will. Chalk on sides of buildings, etc. And
You know, Chris raises the general macro issue of just advising young people to be far more circumspect generally about their social media presence. Even if you're not, but particularly if you're thinking of a career in intelligence work, you should minimize your presence. But it's good advice generally to tell young people, look, you're on there way too much. Get your face off of there. No matter where you're going to work, you're likely to be confronted in a job interview with something that you did on social media that you regret. And it's just smart. It's just smart way of living to be more circumspect about your social media presence.
All right, now we're entering a section that I call short but really tough questions. For instance, was there an intelligence failure in Afghanistan?
Oh, short, huh? Okay. Wow.
Question short, the answer.
Oh, okay. I look, I'm gonna give you a short answer. I'm gonna say yes. I'm gonna say yes. It's not sitting well with me that we didn't see this coming with regard to the speed with which the regime would collapse as we withdrew. And if this had happened in a nation where we had spent a year there, I would say, no, it's not a failure. You can't possibly have the network of sources and the understanding and insights if you've been on the ground 12 months. We weren't there 12 months. We were there many, many years. And so I don't understand how we couldn't have seen this coming. And I don't see how you look at this and go, yeah, this was a success. We did a pretty good job here. I don't see how you say that.
so I'll answer it a little bit differently and say it was a failure, but I don't think, and this is an intelligence officer, keep that in mind, or a former intelligence officer, keep that in mind. But I think it was an operational failure, a failure at a policy level, and a failure at an operational level. Why do I say that? Because there was lots of media reporting saying that Afghanistan would fall without US presence, going down to zero. It would fall in 90 days up to 6 months, but it would fall. My perspective leading up to August was it will fall quicker rather than later. And I suggested perhaps 90 days. But if you argue, and there's a judgment, because it is a judgment from the intelligence community, it's completely unknowable, but because you can't predict the future accurately, you find trends, etc. But at the end of the day, if you say 90 days, then it is up to the United States military planners to plan for worst case scenario. So 90 days doesn't mean you're watching your clock at the 60-day mark, at the 65-day mark. It means you start planning for worst case scenario. What we did, in my humble opinion, the United States completely underestimated the Taliban. That is more of a failure for me. We didn't have a sense for what was happening in the countryside, and the sway and the influence and the legitimacy that the Taliban had. Why? Because for 20 years, although there was lots of fighting in the hinterlands, it was a Kabul-centric view of the world. And Afghanistan is very, very different once you leave Kabul. So there were multiple failures. At the end of the day, I think it was a failure to process the worst case the worst case scenario and plan accordingly. And I've said all along that we should have left a small footprint on the ground, because once we remove that footprint completely, then what we also underestimated is the will of the Afghan people. They were not going to follow the Afghan government. We underestimated that as well. And that's a problem. We didn't fully appreciate the animus of the population against their corrupt leaders. So there were failures, and I'm happy to debate this, but I don't think it was an intelligence failure. I think it was an operational failure. So hopefully that's not a distinction without a difference. I hope that makes sense.
And the second short question, what can be done to stop Russian hacking of our government and corporate computers?
This is a subject that, we could talk endlessly about this. I'm pretty passionate about this threat because it's no longer an over the horizon threat. It's squarely in our face right now. We've seen our food supply, our fuel supply attacked, denial of service. This is the new battlefield, and it's not just Russia. The question needs to really be more on a macro level. And one of the ways, so stopping it isn't going to happen. Mitigating is the way to look at this. And one of the things that needs to happen, like tomorrow or yesterday, is the shoring up of our critical infrastructure companies. So if you are a colonial pipeline, or if you're a major food supplier, as we've seen attacked, if you want to play in the big leagues as part of the U.S. critical infrastructure, you should be subject to baseline threshold security requirements in the cyber world that are required for entree into the critical infrastructure. We've got to start taking control. And I can already hear people saying, "Oh, you want the government to dictate, what private companies do?" Yes, I want them to. I want the government to say, if you want to play in the big leagues, this is what it takes, and that has to happen. And we're far from there yet. And it's surprise after surprise after surprise as we wake up and hear news of yet another denial of service or attack. And it's not just cybersecurity is not just for defense contractors. That's my message here. That's got to be one of the major ways to mitigate what we're seeing our adversaries do.
Yeah, I have nothing further to add. That's a foot stomp what Frank just said. That's a great answer to a tough question.
And here's an interesting one about different and more aggressive forms of espionage done by countries like China, Iran, and North Korea. And are we able to shift our mindset from the old, US versus Russia to, explore new ways to counter different types of more aggressive spycraft?
I'll take a first crack at this because this transition toward countering the asymmetrical threat was what my relatively short tenure as assistant director at Counterintelligence was about. And I say that primarily because the stovepiping in the counterintel community, and particularly at FBI headquarters, which is to say, we have a cyber division, we have a counterintelligence division, we have a counterterrorism division, and in typical bureaucratic fashion, and they're in different buildings or different floors of a building. That's very nice, but our adversaries couldn't care less about the divisions inside the FBI headquarters building. In fact, they exploit those stovepipes. And so the hybrid nature of the threat requires a hybrid cross-disciplinary response. And so literally, and I talk about this in my book, what I did was start breaking walls down. Literally, we smashed drywall and started co-locating cyber units within the counterintelligence division, and vice versa. You can no longer tell the difference between what is a Russian organized crime case and a Russian intelligence service case and a cyber threat versus a nation state sponsor of that threat. And so the FBI is doing that, but perhaps not fast enough. And the CIA's effort, for example, to stand up a China initiative is examples of breaking down the walls, and not allowing the adversary to exploit the various labels that we bureaucratically put on discipline specialties.
Yeah, I would just add, I agree 100% with what Frank said. So 9/11 happened and the counterterrorism enterprise changed completely. It had to. The nation demanded it, the world demanded it, our foreign partners knew it would change, and we learned a lot of lessons on the way. The same bureaucratic lessons, and to Frank's point, nobody cares about the sausage making except for people here in Washington, D.C. But the walls have to come down on counterintelligence, and we have to ramp up our game. So we have to change the way we do some of the business to be more aggressive to counter the services that are working against foreign intelligence services that are working against US and our partner interests. And we're going to have to figure creative ways of doing it. And I would offer a final point. We can look to sort of the 20 years of counterterrorism history as for some bureaucratic examples of how we did that, how we became more aggressive. There are some constructive examples.
Yeah, I just want to add to this. It's not just a whole of government response that's needed to this non-traditional threat. It's a whole of society response. Much of this threat is this new asymmetrical threat involves social media and cyber, as we've been talking about. And so the government can't do that alone. That's going to require unprecedented partnership with the private sector, social media platforms, Silicon Valley. Congress has to get involved in this. This is an all hands on deck. We have to educate our children to be more savvy consumers. Never mind our children, grown-ups have to be more savvy consumers of and able to identify foreign propaganda online. At one point during the 2016 presidential election, 250,000 people were following Russian intelligence service fabricated Facebook accounts. 250,000 people. And we've got to get better at this. And it's not just a counterintelligence community problem. It's an all hands on deck society problem.
Well, gentlemen, thank you for a really great conversation, scary stuff, interesting stuff. And it's always a pleasure to talk to both of you. And I want to thank again our terrific sponsors, the Honorable Mary Beth Long and MAG Aerospace, for support of Spy Chat. Thanks everyone for being here today. If you are feeling like you'd like to support our virtual programs or our public programs, we never mind a little donation to our Spy Museum charitable domain. You can also do that on the website. Everyone take care, be well, and we'll see you the next time.
Thanks, Amanda. Thanks, Spy Team. Thanks, Frank.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.